in today's video, we will be talking about 5 great contributions to the world of science by Brazilian scientists. Since the discovery of Brazil by Pedro Álvares Cabral, Brazil has born and bred great scientists that have contributed to the modernization of the world. Even though Brazil tops South America in terms of research and harbors some of the best research institutions in the continent, history presents something a little bit strange. The Portuguese, who had discovered this part of the world, delayed the growth and popularization of science in Brazil out of fear that an educated class of Brazilians with thirst for political independence and nationalism might emerge, just as it had occurred in some neighboring Spanish colonies and the United States of America. So sometimes, you have to oppress the people so that they wouldn't have access to information. That's the best way to control people anywhere in the world. Notwithstanding, there were other initiatives to push scientific research forward, such as the installment of astronomical observatory by the Dutch in the city called Recife. So just to give you a dimension of the state where I live, that is Maranhão, here in the northeastern part of the country, it was controlled by the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. So you have 3 powers, going through this place. But science itself took off in the 19th century after the relocation of the Portuguese crown to Brazil. The first is the electronic voting system. Since we live in a technological era, why not make things easier? Since 1932, the Brazilian Electoral Code had already foreseen the use of voting machine. Therefore, many inventors tried to come up with a machine capable of achieving this task. In 1958, to be specific, a Brazilian inventor called Socrates Ricardo Puntel came up with a first electronic voting machine. But since there were many limiting factors such as low resistance, relatively difficult to operate, you have a large population that really would have it difficult to operate the machine, and low trust in the machine itself. It was also relatively large and heavy, and transportation would be very difficult. For these reasons, the machine was never used. Cutting the history short, the first electronic voting took place in 1989 in Brusque, a city in the southern part of Brazil under the Santa Catarina state, using a system developed by 2 brothers, Roberto and Carlos Prudencio. Instead of typing the voting codes or names of the candidates, the voters filled a ballot paper and inserted them into the electronic voting machine, which registered and stamped them. It was somehow semi-automatic. So after which, the voters took the ballot papers to conventional boxes. So in case of any doubt after the election, the papers were there to clear them all. So the current electronic voting machine So the second invention by a Brazilian engineer or Brazilian scientist is the automatic transmission. I believe if you drive a car, you would probably know that there are different types. Since the invention of automobile, several contributions have been made to sophisticate it. Some of the sophistications were to improve efficiency, increase speed, to regulate and observe the entire machinery, to mention but a few. Other inventions were to improve the beauty and comfort of the car. Talking about sophistication to ease the usage of the car, José Braz and Fernando Limos, who were mechanical engineers, developed a gear system which could transmit automatically using hydraulic fluid. In 1932, José traveled to Detroit to present his invention to the General Motors. There was already an automatic system on ground developed by a Canadian engineer. That particular system was pneumatic, so General Motors decided to look at José's invention. It was fascinating. It was, robust. So General Motors was interested in that, and they gave them 2 options. The first was to accept, a payment of $10,000. At that time, that was, a very good amount of money, or accept $1 for each car produced with that particular technology. What was their option? If you say the first option, you're right. Okay, they accepted the $10,000 offer. The automatic transmission only hit the market in 1939. So General Motors decided to start producing, and today you have many cars with such system. The third invention by a Brazilian is the typewriter. Although there are some controversies, because during the time of invention there were many engineers and scientists working on typing machines. Okay. According to historical documents, the first typewriting machine was patented in England in 1714 by Henry Mill. Details of Mill's typewriter are unknown because it never became popular, but patent notes show that it made counterfeiting more difficult and eased reading and writing. Even though there were several other typewriters, that accomplished special tasks like typing musical notation, braille, and etc. In the 19th century, the first commercial typewriter was produced in 1873 by Christopher Sholes. But before 1873, let's go back a little bit to northeastern state of Brazil called Recife. According to registers, one Roman Catholic priest called João Francisco de Azevedo came up with a typewriter in 1861 called Máquina Taquigráfica, where he adapted a 24-key piano so that it could type alphabets on a paper. Since it was an interesting invention, he presented it to a negotiator called George Napoleon, who affirmed that the technology could be of interest to some companies there in the United States of America. George Napoleon traveled to the USA and never returned. He never gave an answer, but a few years later, similar technology was presented by Christopher Sholes. There is still doubt. You have the coincidence there, but you judge it yourself. Okay. The fourth invention by a Brazilian is the stereo belt. So many people will be confused about that. It will sound more familiar when we say Walkman. Yes, of course, Walkman. So nowadays you don't have Walkman. Children born from 2000 and 2000 to 2010 wouldn't really be familiar with the equipment. That was a revolutionary invention. Walkman, as it would be said, was the first portable audio in history. It was built in 1972. The inventor was born in Germany but grew up in Brazil, and he developed his device while he was living in São Paulo. São Paulo is the largest city in Brazil. His aim was to add soundtrack to real life, where one could enjoy music while doing activities on the street like walking or practicing exercise. He started initial tests in February 1972 in Switzerland. He experienced floating sensation while playing his stereo belt. So while he listened to tracks of Heavy Man and Duane Allman, he watched the mountain snowfall. He realized that the combination of music and scenery could ameliorate aesthetics of events. After the initial tests, Pavel presented his model to electronic manufacturers like Philips, Yamaha, ITT, and Grande. He was still not discouraged and went ahead to register his patent in Italy in 1977. Also in Germany, UK, USA, and Japan, he registered the patent in 1978. He was a very smart guy. You ridicule my object, but I still registered it. Coincidentally, Sony launched a famous Walkman personal stereo player in 1979 and sold about 200 million units in just 2 years. Wow. That was really large. So years later, to be precise, between 1980 and 1986, in friendly negotiations, Sony agreed to pay Pavel royalties of almost 1% over specific models of Walkman sold in Germany. But the big issue was that Sony never agreed to recognize Walkman as Pavel's invention. In 1989, Pavel filed a suit in British justice system against Sony in order to recover ownership rights of of his invention. Unfortunately, his case was dismissed 7 years after. He was almost bankrupt. He had used almost 3 million euros in the process. He threatened to continue battling in court in other countries that he had registered his patent. Finally, in 2001, Sony signed a new and secret multi-million agreement with Pavel, and it is said that he had continued to look for other companies that were using the same technology in other, to see if he could have a talk with them like Apple. The fifth and final invention, or the greatest invention here in Brazil, is the aeroplane, or the Americans would say airplane. The International Aeronautical Federation recognizes Wright brothers as the inventors of aeroplane. But there are also great engineers that have contributed in its perfection. Today we have planes that are very sophisticated and they are considered the safest means of transportation. Santos Dumont has to be mentioned when it comes to the evolution of airplanes. Before we talk about his contribution, let's look at his biography. He was born in Minas Gerais, which is a state here in the southern part of Brazil, on the 20th of July 1873. He was the sixth kid of a very wealthy family of coffee farmers. His grandfather had migrated to Brazil in the mid-19th century in search of precious stones. So it was a family of jewelers. It is registered that although Santos Dumont was not an outstanding student in school, he always was a curious boy. He talked about creating equipment that could make man fly. That's to have a controlled flight. Smart boy. In 1892, he moved to Paris. There, he was fascinated about combustion engines. He went ahead to study more about combustion engines and airships. Throughout the late 19th century, he worked on airships before starting working on his airplane. In 1906, he completed his 14 Bs. On the 12th of November at 4:45 p.m., he took off at Chateau de Bagatelle, where he covered a distance of 220 meters. The Wright brothers were actually the first to fly and present basic principles about airplanes. But for an airplane to take off and land on its own, that was the evolution that Santos Dumont brought. He was able to use his engine to take off and land. So as a bonus, there is something that Santos Dumont invented. While he wanted to control the time of his flight, during that time the watch was not on the wrist. I want to control my time of flight, and then I need my watch on my wrist. So that was another invention. So I hope you enjoyed the video.